Hello, everyone. Welcome to or welcome back to Station 07.1 Podfix. I'm your host, Rin, and this is the continuation of You're on Your Own, Kid by CastleintheAir1989. This is Chapter 2, Just to Learn That You Never Cared. Content warning: this chapter involves bullying and minor violence. Okumura-sensei laughed to himself. There were so many times he wanted to get rid of the kid, and now an opportunity practically fell into his lap. He'd requested to transfer Midoriya several times, but the other third-year teachers always blocked his request. Not that he was surprised that no one else wanted the kid in their class. But he was rather tired of the dirty looks he received when he suggested that maybe it would be better if the kid was put in a different class. It wasn't fair to his students to have to deal with a quirkless kid distracting them. Sato-san was so old anyway, it was about time she retired. And now with her out of the way, and her replacement not here yet, there was no one to complain about the transfer. Good riddance. Kids like him shouldn't be allowed to go to school with the rest of them. Sighing, he shook his head. At least he wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. He was someone else's problem now. Midoriya! The sharp voice of his teacher startled Izuku out of his thoughts, sending a stab of worry skittering through him. A new hero had made her debut this morning on the news, taking down a pair of villains in a convenience store robbery. He was already planning a new entry in his analysis journal, and was a little distracted this morning. And then he ran into some of Kachan's friends, who decided it would be fun to throw his backpack down the stairs, spilling his books and papers everywhere. After he gathered all his things, he was barely able to make it to class on time. What did you say, Kumura-sensei? Kumura-sensei frowned at him, and Izuku felt the 5 fingerprint-shaped bruises on his arm throb, a harsh reminder of yesterday. You need to pay more attention, he lectured, voice loud enough for the rest of the class to hear. They perked up, eagerly anticipating the dressing down of their favorite target. Honestly, you show up to class late. He'd made it before the bell rang. Your uniform is a mess. It was torn from the bullies this morning, but that was hardly his fault, not like his teacher ever cared. And you can't even be bothered to listen to when people are talking to you. His voice dripped with contempt. Sorry, he whispered, dropping his gaze. The other students laughed, enjoying his discomfort. You're transferring to Class 3C, effective immediately, he glared at him. Now go, you're already late. It felt as if the breath had been knocked out of him. Really, though, Izuku supposed he shouldn't be surprised anymore. Kumura-sensei hated him. It wasn't out of character that he'd look for a way to get rid of him. Get out, boy, he shouted. Do I have to say it again? Izuku scurried out of the room, face burning in humiliation, leaving the jeers and laughs and murmurs behind him. Out in the hallway, he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. He didn't want to be an anxious mess when meeting his new teacher. Not that it would matter. They never liked him anyway. He hurried over to the class. Kumura-sensei would probably be delighted by the fact that, in waiting until homeroom started to inform Izuku of the transfer, he'd ensure Izuku would get to class after the bell rang. He picked up his pace. Sato-sensei had never liked him, but she hadn't been as bad as some of the other teachers. And she was certainly not as bad as Kumura-sensei. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. It was so much worse than he'd anticipated. Stumbling into class very much after the bell rang, Izuku laid eyes on a teacher who was decidedly not Sato-sensei. Instead of a 67-year-old woman standing at the front of the classroom, there was a tall, dark-haired man in her place. Sorry I'm late. I'm Midoriya, Izuku, and I think I'm supposed to be in your class? Now, I'm supposed to be in your class now. I used to be in class 3B. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore his nerves and tightening his grip on the straps of his backpack in an attempt to stop his hands from shaking. The other man studied him, and Izuku had to stop himself from shrinking away from his gaze. "I think there's a seat free over there." He gestured to a spot at the front of the classroom. Izuku hated sitting near the front. He paid attention in class, always took notes, and never tried to sleep in class, but it was better to be far away as possible from his teachers. Sometimes the teachers would forget about him if he sat in the back, or at the very least they seemed content to ignore him for the most part, but the closer he sat to them, the more they noticed him. It was always very, very bad to be noticed. He collapsed in the seat and tried to ignore the dirty looks he got from his new classmates. He had no illusions about how he'd be received by the other students in this class. The bullying was not confined to Class 3B. Rather, the whole school seemed to hold the same level of contempt for him. "I'm Aizawa Ch2. The man introduced himself. "I will be your new history as well as homeroom teacher." "I thought he was a substitute," someone behind Izuku whispered. "I wonder what happened to Sato-sensei," wondered one student. "I bet she finally moved to Tokyo to be nearer to her grandkids like she was always talking about," speculated another. "Shh, he'll hear you. I'm being quiet. You're the one who's being loud." Aizawa-sensei cleared his throat, leveling an exasperated look at the class, effectively silencing the murmurings. Picking up a paper from his desk, he went through the class roster, taking roll. Izuku didn't know most of the names of his new classmates, but he recognized some of the faces of the kids he knew to avoid. Izuku shrank in his seat when Aizawa-sensei's gaze landed on him, and reluctantly mumbled a barely audible "here." Aizawa-sensei handed a stack of worksheets to a girl in the front row to pass around. Izuku reached his hand out when the stack of papers made to the boy sitting next to him. The boy looked him in the eye, but instead of handing the stack to Izuku, he deliberately dropped it on the ground, not bothering to even pretend it was an accident. A small smirk played out around his lips as Izuku scrambled for the papers. When he finally looked up, he noticed Aizawa-sensei watching him. He flushed and hurried to pass the worksheets on to the next person. He tried to concentrate on his work, but he could sense Aizawa-sensei's eyes studying him. Ducking his head, he shrank away from his teacher's inquisitive gaze and answered the next question. The assignment was fairly easy, and he finished it quickly. Covertly glancing around to gauge how far along the other students were, he reviewed his answers. He was confident he had gotten everything right, but it was never good to come across as too confident. Erasing his answer for question 3, he wrote it so that it was close, but just not quite right. None of his teachers ever managed to believe that someone quirkless could do so well without cheating, so he was forced to purposely miss questions to avoid their wrath. It was difficult, finding the right balance between doing well enough so as to not affect his grades very badly, and not doing so well it was unbelievable. He kept his eyes down until he counted 4 students getting up to hand in their worksheets. Biting his lip, he walked to the front of the classroom and laid the paper on the stack on Aizawa-sensei's desk. On his way back to his seat, another student, he didn't see who, kicked his leg out from under him. Stumbling, he barely caught himself on his desk. Aizawa-sensei's head snapped up, his sharp gaze drilling into Izuku. Expecting a rebuke, Izuku froze, waiting for his teacher to reprimand him. But Aizawa-sensei went back to what he was doing without saying a word. Barely stopping himself from breathing a sigh of relief, Izuku resolved to do his best to not be noticeable. Maybe he'd be able to make it through the class if he could just manage that. After what felt like ages, the bell rang, class letting out for the day. He hurried out the door, careful not to look in Aizawa-sensei's direction. He was so focused on getting out of the classroom without attracting attention notice from his teacher that he didn't notice the set of footsteps following too closely behind him until he was outside the school and just about to climb down the stairs that led to Eldora's intimidating entrance. A sharp push at his back sent him tumbling down the concrete stairs outside the school building. He hit the ground, knocking the breath out of him, his wrist striking the pavement hard and bending painfully underneath his chest. He recognized the people who shoved him as part of his old class. "I can't believe you finally got kicked out of 3B. Are you kidding? Of course a quirkless kid wouldn't cut it." His lip curled with disgust on the word. Izuku tried to push himself up with his uninjured hand as the boys circled him like hyenas surrounding their prey. "Good riddance, too. I'd say we're better off without him." One of the boys kicked Izuku's good hand out from under him, forcing him to catch himself with his injured one or risk smashing his face against the concrete, leaving his head in the prime kicking zone. The move shot jagged bursts of pain from his wrist all the way up his arm. Biting his cheek to keep a moan from escaping, he scrambled the rest of the way up to a standing position, not wanting to give them an easy target. They continued to taunt him as he backed away. "I'm not surprised he failed," one of them sneered. "How could someone like him succeed in our class?" They laughed, still advancing, and Izuku continued his retreat. Izuku knew the truth. He knew that the only reason he was moved was because Kumura-sensei hated him, not because he was stupid. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't. But the words still stung. Finally, he managed to edge far enough out of the reach that he can turn his back on them and dash off. He didn't let himself slow down until he'd made it inside his apartment, breathing ragged and chest heaving. Hurriedly shutting the door behind himself, he leaned his back against it, exhausted. The throbbing in his wrist demanded his attention. He carefully edged his sleeve up, revealing red, swollen skin. It was probably going to bruise, but hopefully it wasn't broken. He really didn't want to worry his mom about this. Drawing in a shaky breath, he grabbed an ice pack for his wrist and took a few painkillers for good measure, aiming to get the swelling down before his mom got home and could notice something was wrong. Maybe tomorrow would be better. If he could get to class on time, somehow manage to avoid the kids who'd pushed him, and keep his head down, maybe he'd be able to get through the day okay. The students were talking loudly amongst themselves when Shota entered the classroom, but with the addition of his presence, they halted their chattering, staring at him. As the bell rang, the students reluctantly made their way to their seats. A nervous-looking green-haired kid dashed in the room. Sorry I'm late. I'm Midoriya Izuku?" The kid stuttered out, explaining he just transferred here from a different class. Shota pointed out an empty seat and watched as the kid practically threw himself in the chair. He introduced himself to the class, which caused a cacophony of whispered confusion. He had no doubt the rumors about what had happened to their previous teacher would run wild. Clearing his throat to get their attention back, he took roll, noting how Midoriya shrank away when his attention landed on him, and seemed afraid to meet his gaze. Shota handed out a history worksheet for the class to pass around. Thankfully, the previous teacher had left lesson plans behind in her, now Shota's, office. While he was perfectly capable of preparing his own assignments, he didn't have time to put anything together at such short notice. When the stack of papers reached Midoriya, the other student dropped them before he could get a hold of them. The kid scrambled to pick them up as if it had been his fault they fell in the first place. When he noticed Shota's eye on him, he flushed and quickly looked away. The kid was a bundle of nervous energy. He appeared tense while completing the worksheet, and if anything, that tension increased as he approached Shota's desk to turn it in. Shota looked away briefly and immediately regretted it. He heard a clatter that made him snap his head back up in time to see Midoriya sprawled almost face first into his desk. Other kids around him were not so subtly snickering. Ch2 suspected the spill had not been an accident, internally berating himself for not paying more attention when he knew something seemed off. Midoriya's reaction to being tripped only served to cement that something more was wrong. When Ch2's eyes met his, the kid froze and shrank in on himself, face draining of color. His shoulders hunched, he waited, not moving, for a few moments before finally uncurling and taking his seat. For the rest of the period, he kept his eyes strictly down. That was not a healthy reaction. Something more was definitely at play here. Unfortunately, Ch2's resolution to keep an eye on Midoriya was temporarily put out of his mind at the start of the next class's history lesson. They were somehow the most obnoxious class he had ever taught, including the one he expelled this year. But by far the most obnoxious of them all was one Bakugo Katsuki. The boy was loud, brash, and had no respect for authority or the other students. Half the other kids seemed to flock around him, whether from fear or admiration, he couldn't tell yet, and the other half was very careful to keep out of his way. It was interesting, to say the least. After classes had finished for the day, he made his way to the teacher's lounge, planning to grade assignments so he could observe the other teachers without being suspicious. He normally preferred to work on that kind of thing at home or in his office, but, regrettably, he needed to keep an eye on these people. As first days of class went, Ch2 had worse. Granted, on those worse days, someone usually ended up in the hospital, or, on rare occasions, in jail. So maybe his bar for what a bad day looks like was set a little low. But still, it could have been much worse, but that didn't change the fact that his new coworkers were probably the least tolerable people he'd met. And he'd spent 2 weeks working on a case with Endeavor, so that was saying something. But even the number 2 hero had the sense not to say some of the things he thought out loud. Ch2 may dislike working with him, and dislike him as a person, but Endeavor wasn't so stupid that he had incriminating conversations in public. Apparently these people were that stupid. Taking advantage of said idiocy, he sat grading assignments, eavesdropping on a conversation between 2 co-workers whose names he didn't remember. "What have you planned for tonight?" a blue-haired woman asked her co-worker while Ch2 sat in the background marking papers. "I've got a stack of tests to grade," the other teacher answered, shuddering. She winced sympathetically. "I feel you. I have a ton of essays to look over." Midoriya submitted another long one. "Sometimes I don't even read the things. I mean, there's no way he could get a good grade on it anyway." She rolled her eyes in disgust, and her coworker laughed. "I know," the man agreed. "He's much too proud for his own good. I've had to take points off his tests before. There's no way a kid like him could get a perfect score without cheating. If someone doesn't teach him a lesson, he'll go through life thinking he's the same as the rest of us." Ch2's grip tightened on his pen. He ducked his head to hide the anger playing out in his eyes at their blatant mistreatment of one of their students. One of his students now. "It's too bad not all students can be as promising as Bakugo," the man continued, "but Midoriya is just so disruptive in class. I really don't know why everyone still puts up with him." Now, that was laughable. Midoriya barely made his presence known in class, only speaking when prompted, seemingly terrified that he was making a nuisance of himself by simply existing. It was no wonder he acted the way he did, based on the way the other teachers talked about him. True, he's such a bright boy, a real pleasure to have in class, unlike some of the brats around here. She gave him a meaningful look. Ch2 held back a snort at the highly embellished description of Bakugo. Laughing, they both walked through the door, leaving Ch2 blessedly alone, horrified at how they so casually discussed mistreating one of their students, and that they purposely give the kid a lower grade than what he scored. Ch2 gathered up the papers he'd been grading and threw them in his bag, barely containing his rage. The way they talked about these kids was disgusting. He was definitely needed to learn those teachers' names now. He was going to fill out a scathing report on them in his case file the minute he got home. He briefly wondered what they could possibly have against Midoriya. From what he observed today, the kid seemed quiet, if a little nervous, but overall much less disruptive than some of the other students. He certainly hadn't done anything to deserve such revulsion. One thing was sure, this school was rotten to the core. That is the end of Chapter 2. If you enjoyed, let me know in the comments section, and make sure to tune in next time for Chapter 3. That is all, and this is Station 07.1 Podfix.